The wind howled against the walls of the small cabin, pulling at the corners of the porch like it wanted in. She sat alone, stitching by the dim light of an oil lamp, until the flame flickered once, then twice, and went out. She sighed, stepping outside to relight it. She caught something in the corner of her eye, a shape hunched over near the steps, where the shadows of the porch met the open dirt. She squinted. At first she thought it was a heap of blankets, or maybe a discarded. "Do you see?" But then it moved. It was a man. She froze. No one came out here, not at night. Not unless they were drunk, desperate or dangerous. Slowly, cautiously, she descended the stairs. The wind snapped at her shawl as she approached. The man was slumped sideways, half conscious, his back against the woodpile. Blood had soaked through his shirt and was dripping onto the cold dirt. His face was bruised and unshaven, his eyes closed. She looked around. Nothing but trees and prairie grass. No horse, no wagon, no footprints except his, leading from the road to her porch like a trail of guilt. It was happening again, the test. The kind of moment the town elders warned about. In church, temptation, chaos, outsiders, and yet he was breathing but barely. She knelt beside him. "Can you hear me?" A slight nod. His lips were cracked and dry. "Water," he whispered. "Water. Just water." She stood and hesitated. She wasn't supposed to help strangers. Not after dark. Not in Willow Creek. That rule had been nailed to every barn door for years. Ever since the raids. Ever since the last widow who showed kindness had been dragged into the square and shamed until she left town. They'd do worse to her. She had no husband, no father, no name anymore. Just whispers. Ever since Reverend Granger died, people only called her the widow. And even that with a curl of suspicion in their mouths. His death had been called unnatural and no one forgot. Still she brought the water. Still she pressed it to his lips. Still she opened her door. Inside she laid him on the cot. He didn't speak again. Not a name, not a reason. Just sleep and shallow breathing. She cleaned his wound with boiled cloth, fed him broth and sat by the fire until dawn. Her heart never stopped pounding. What if someone saw? What if someone heard? When the morning light finally broke through the shutters, she felt relief. Maybe he'd be strong enough to leave before anyone noticed. Maybe the night's kindness could pass like a dream. She was wrong. Before the rooster crowed twice, she heard them. The unmistakable sound of hooves against dry earth. Horses, several men with gravel in their voices and fire in their hands. She peered through the curtains. 3 riders, coats buttoned, hats low, town elders. One of them carried a torch. Another held a rope. She couldn't breathe for a second. They stopped at her gate, dismounted in silence, and marched toward the porch. Then came the voice of Elder Cranford, booming, judgmental, unmistakable. "You let the devil into your house, widow." She stepped back from the window, pulse thundering. The man still slept, unaware. Her hands shook. She hadn't done anything wrong, but in Willow Creek, kindness after dark was treason. And the punishment had always been fire. She didn't move. The knock came like thunder. 3 sharp pounds against the wooden door that still smelled of smoke from last winter's fire. She could hear their boots on the porch now, scraping the planks like a warning. The torchlight flickered through the slats of the window. Her hand hovered over the latch. "I know you're in there," Elder Cranford growled. "You've been seen." Seen, that word cut deeper than judgment. In Willow Creek, to be seen doing what they called sin was worse than guilt itself. It meant the punishment was already being whispered across fences and in pews. No matter what. Truth, you held in your heart. She stepped back slowly. The wounded man lay still on the cot, barely stirring. She had wrapped him in her late husband's blanket, the one with the faded crosses stitched into the edges. And now it looked like she had draped her dead past over a stranger's sins. She had always lived on the town's edge, both in geography and in spirit. The cabin had belonged to her husband, Reverend Elias Granger, who once filled the church with hymns and fire and brimstone sermons. People said he'd brought God to Willow Creek, but when he died, sudden pale gasping in the pulpit, the same people turned on her like wolves in Sunday clothes. They needed someone to blame. She poisoned his coffee. She read books after dark. She talks to herself. The accusations had no proof, but truth in Willow Creek was often decided by how loud it was shouted. After the funeral they stopped calling her by name. Even the children whispered behind her back. In stores the shopkeepers looked past her. At church the pew behind her always stayed empty. The only thing that kept them from dragging her out entirely was the memory of her husband and the fact that no one wanted to admit they might have misjudged his choice of bride. But hosting a stranger, a bleeding man no less, that broke the final rule. A voice from outside called again, this time more formal, rehearsed. By order of the town council, you are to exit the premises and explain your actions. If you delay, we'll act on behalf of the law. She almost laughed. The law. There were no sheriffs in Willow Creek, no courts, just the council of elders, and whatever gospel they carved into the town's conscience that week. The man stirred, his eyes fluttered open, brown, alert, full of pain. He tried to speak, but she pressed her finger to his lips. Don't, she whispered. They'll kill you. He looked at her confused. His gaze flicked toward the door, then back to her face, searching for understanding. I don't know who you are, she said softly, but they won't care. You're not one of them, and neither am I. The porch groaned again, heavier this time. She heard Elder Cranford give a signal. Boots pounded down the steps, then silence. She peeked out the side window. They had circled the house. One man now poured a dark liquid along the wooden edge of the back wall. Another unraveled the rope. The third lit the torch anew, letting the flame swell until it roared. Panic welled in her chest. She looked at the man lying on her cot. If you can walk, you need to go now. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached slowly under the blanket and pulled out something she hadn't seen before. A chain. On the end hung a carved wooden symbol, worn but familiar. A black cross, painted and chipped. She gasped. She'd heard of him. The man with the black cross. The one they said had vanished years ago after tearing down the corrupt sheriff in Red Hollow. A ghost. A myth. A punisher. And now he lay bleeding in her cabin. The black cross dangled between his fingers, swaying gently with each shallow breath he took. She stared at it, breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. She had only heard stories, passed from traveler to traveler, always whispered. A man who rode alone. A man who never spoke unless it was the last thing someone heard before dying. A man who delivered justice in places where law had turned to rot. No name, just the symbol. And now he was in her home. He tried to sit up, his hand pressed against his wound, but the effort drained what little strength he had left. She rushed to his side. You'll tear it open again, she warned. Lie back, but he shook his head, jaw clenched. He glanced toward the door. The voices outside had quieted. The crackling of torch flame grew louder. They'll burn this place, she whispered. They'll burn you alive and call it holy. He looked at her again, eyes steady, then pointed slowly to the back of the cabin, toward the cellar. She hesitated. The cellar hadn't been opened in years. Her husband used to store dry goods and tools there, but after his death she'd sealed it shut. Too many memories, too many ghosts. Still she moved quickly, lifting the wooden trap door by the stove. Dust flew up. The smell of earth and old coal hit her like a memory. You won't survive the ride, she said, helping him off the cot. But they can't find you, not yet. With her arm around his back, they hobbled to the cellar door. He was heavy, but he leaned on her gently, never more than he had to. She guided him down the steps, then pulled the door shut, covering it with a rug just as she heard boots on the porch again. A fist pounded on the window. Last warning, came the voice of Elder Cranford. Open the door, widow, or we'll make an example of you both. She wiped her hands on her skirt and steadied herself. Then she opened the door. 3 men stood before her, firelight dancing in their eyes. Whitlow with his thick beard and iron gaze, Elder Dale thin and twitchy, always looking to Whitlow before speaking, and Elias Fitch, the youngest, silent but with hands that liked matches. She didn't say a word. You housed a stranger, Whitlow growled. A man bleeding on your porch. Do you deny it? She said nothing. Dale leaned forward. We saw him. Then where is he now? Fitch asked, stepping past the threshold. She blocked his path. You'll find no one here. The air was thick with heat and threat. Whitlow's eyes narrowed. Then you'll explain the blood on your porch, the tracks in the dirt you think were blind. I think you're frightened, she replied, her voice low. Because a man needed help and I gave it. Dale gasped. Fitch drew a knife. Whitlow didn't move. He looked around the cabin, the cot, the bandages, the basin still tinged red. His jaw tightened. You've chosen your side, he said. He turned, then paused at the door. There will be a council meeting at dusk. You will be summoned. You best prepare your soul. They left without another word. She shut the door and leaned on it, heart racing, breath shaking. Below her feet, the cellar was silent. She knelt, lifted the trap door again, and descended slowly. He sat upright now, back against the stone wall, the black cross in his palm. "You knew they'd come," she said. He nodded once. "Why me?" He looked at her silent and calm, but something strong behind his gaze. Then, for the first time, he spoke. "You opened the door." By midday, the news had spread like prairie fire. Women whispered behind curtains. Men gathered outside the general store, pretending to discuss seed prices while glancing toward the ridge where her cabin stood. Even children warned not to speak mimicked the scene in hushed theatrical tones. "She let him in," they said. She gave him bread. Back inside the cabin, she moved with deliberate calm. She changed the sheets, swept the floor, boiled water, not because the house needed tending, but because her hands needed something to do. Every few minutes, she'd lift the cellar door just enough to check on him. He rested with his eyes closed, one arm over his chest, the black cross now tucked beneath his shirt. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask what he'd done. She only watched how he breathed. Slow, steady, alive. Outside, the wind shifted, and with it came hooves. Not the gallop of riders in haste, but the slow ceremonial trot of those who arrived to judge. The elders had returned. This time, they brought the town with them. She stepped onto the porch and faced them. Dozens had gathered. Men on horseback, women with stern mouths. The council of elders stood at the front, flanked by the church deacons. They hadn't come for discussion. They had come for display. Elder Cranford raised his voice. "You were warned. You defied the word of the council. I followed my conscience," she said. "That is not the law in Willow Creek. The law in Willow Creek changes when it's convenient," she said calmly. "I remember when we gave bread to strangers, when we knelt beside the sick, when the church stood for mercy." A murmur spread through the crowd. Discomfort, disapproval, and something deeper, memory. But Whitlow pressed forward. "You harbored a fugitive. We have a right to investigate. You have no right to enter this home." He raised a hand. Two men stepped forward, younger, eager to obey. They approached the cabin. Suddenly a sound stopped them. A door creaking open went from behind. All eyes turned. The cellar door. He stood at the top step, leaning slightly, the blanket draped over his shoulder, the black cross gleaming against his chest. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a Bible. Whitlow paled. "You," he muttered. "You're dead." The man said nothing. Dale took a step back, nearly stumbling. Fitch's mouth opened, but no words came. They all knew him now. Not a stranger, not a bandit, a name unspoken, but carved into memory. The one who had passed judgment when lawmen failed. The one who had vanished after cleaning the blood of a sheriff off his boots. He stepped fully into the light, eyes sweeping across the townsfolk, not with hate, but with a quiet reckoning. No one dared move. Then slowly, he turned and looked at her. Just one nod, and then back at Whitlow. Still no words, but none were needed, because in that silence, everyone heard the truth. No one spoke. The man stood still as stone, one hand resting lightly on the cellar door frame. His shoulders were broad, but not in a boastful way. They carried weight, not pride. His boots, scuffed and dark with dry blood, sank slightly into the porch floor. The sun behind him painted a halo of dust in the air, as if the earth itself had paused to watch. She looked at him, really looked, not as a wounded stranger anymore, but as something else, a presence, an answer, maybe not to prayer, but to pain. The townsfolk fidgeted. Dale glanced around as if expecting someone else to take charge. Fitch clenched his fists but didn't move. Even Whitlow, always quick to raise his voice, now swallowed the words forming on his tongue. The black cross on the stranger's chest seemed to burn itself into their vision. Someone whispered his name, or at least what they thought it was. The man with no home but every road. The one who'd once walked into a courthouse and walked out alone. The one who left behind towns with fewer liars than before. "He should be dead," someone muttered. "He's here," another answered. And that was enough. Whitlow stepped forward, trying to reclaim the fire in his tone. "You don't belong here. This is our town. You bring nothing but unrest." The man didn't blink. Whitlow turned to the crowd. "He's dangerous. You all know what he's done." Still, no one moved. So Whitlow changed tactics. "And you," he shouted at her. "You chose this. You brought him into our midst. This woman who's never once knelt for forgiveness in our church, who never wept at her husband's grave, who reads books instead of scripture. Is that who you'd follow now?" The crowd shifted, uncertain. She stepped down from the porch, barefoot in the dirt, eyes fixed on Whitlow. You speak of forgiveness but know nothing of mercy. My husband died in that pulpit while you preached over him, and when you couldn't blame God you blamed me. A hush fell. You left me to rot in this house. You called me cursed. You taught your children to spit at my feet, and yet she turned slightly, gesturing to the stranger behind her. He asked nothing. He simply looked at me, and I was no longer invisible. Whitlow turned red with fury. You'll burn for this. But now his voice sounded thinner, less certain. Then without warning the stranger moved, not toward Whitlow, not toward anyone. He walked slowly to the center of the crowd and stopped. He pulled something from his coat, a folded piece of parchment stained with time and dirt. He handed it to a boy standing at the edge of the crowd. Read. The second word he'd spoken since arriving. The boy, trembling, opened it. His voice cracked as he began. It was a pardon signed by a federal judge. Dated 3 years ago. The crimes the man had once been hunted for. Gone. Overturned. Proven false. Silence fell again. Deeper this time. Embarrassed, exposed. Elder Dale turned away. Fitch dropped his knife. Whitlow looked like a man who had swallowed coal. And then the stranger did something no one expected. He sat right there in the dirt, back straight, eyes forward, hands resting calmly on his knees, as if to say, I'm not hiding. I'm not running, judge me now. And in that moment, no one dared. He sat like a statue in the dust, the black cross on his chest casting a long shadow across the ground. The town stared. No one moved. Not even the wind dared speak. She stood beside him now, no longer shielding him but simply there, as if some silent thread now tethered their fates. She wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever judgment came, she would face it at his side. The boy still held the parchment, hands trembling. His father reached down and took it from him, scanning the words with squinting eyes. Then his shoulders slumped, and he passed it along. One by one, the elders read it, each face dimmed with shame, some turning pale, some red, but none with pride. Dale was the first to speak. It says, you were framed. The man gave no answer. Fitch stepped back. Then why come here? Why now? Still no reply. It was Whitlow who realized first. His eyes narrowed. You're not here by accident. Someone told you. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Names were whispered. Old names. Forgotten names. Years ago, this town had hung a man without trial. A trapper who had been blamed for a child's disappearance. But some swore he was innocent. Some said he'd begged for mercy, that he'd called for the preacher, her husband. The widow's jaw tightened. She had been there that night. Not in the square, but outside, listening behind the church door, as Whitlow whispered to Reverend Elias Granger that it was better for the town if they didn't ask too many questions. That silence, he said, was sometimes a shepherd's duty. Josiah had returned home pale, shaken. He never preached the same way again, and months later he collapsed at the pulpit. Heart stopped, eyes wide, but she remembered what he said. Before he died, they killed him, Clara. I stayed silent. God help me, I stayed silent. And now, sitting before her in the dirt, was the price of that silence. The stranger finally lifted his head. His voice was low but steady. I came for the truth. Just that, nothing more. Whitlow stiffened. You think this town owes you something? The man looked up straight into his eyes. I think someone here sent word. Someone who regretted what they let happen. He turned to the crowd, and for the first time, people lowered their eyes. It wasn't just guilt. It was memory of the trapper who brought meat when the winters were hard, of the boy who vanished, of the night the truth got buried to preserve peace, and of a preacher who stopped speaking. Then, from the back of the crowd, an old woman stepped forward. She walked slowly, cane tapping the earth. Her name was Hannah Wren, once the town midwife, now mostly forgotten. Her voice cracked with age, but it carried. I sent the letter, she said. Gasps followed. I was there that night. I watched them lie. I watched them throw a rope over that man's neck while Whitlow said a prayer, and I've watched this town rot ever since. Whitlow turned to her, fury in his eyes. You dare. I'm old, she snapped, and I'm tired of seeing evil wear the face of righteousness. Silence. The man with the black cross stood, but this time he didn't look threatening. He looked free. I'm not here for revenge, he said. He turned to the widow. I'm here because someone remembered. The silence didn't last. Whitlow turned from Hannah Wren to the crowd, his voice rising like a blaze. She's poisoned this place, don't you see? One man's sins can be forgiven, but this woman, she defies order. She defies the church. She defies you. People shifted, uneasily. The truth had shaken them, but not enough to break the fear. Fitch shouted, She harbored a man who could have killed us all. He's pardoned. Someone called out. Then why's he hiding? Fitch fired back. Why sneak in like a thief? The man with the black cross didn't answer. He stood quietly at the widow's side, hands loose at his sides, not clenched, just waiting. That's what frightened them most. Not his strength, his stillness. Whitlow pressed forward. This woman broke the sacred law of Willow Creek. She sheltered a stranger, lied to the elders, brought fire to our gates. She brought bread, Hannah Wren murmured, and mercy. But the old woman's words were drowned out. Whitlow raised his hand and pointed toward the chapel bell in the distance. Let the council decide, he thundered. At sunset, she'll stand trial in front of the congregation. He looked directly at the widow. You've always wanted the town to look at you. Now it will. They took her not with ropes, but with rules. The council decreed she would be escorted, not chained but surrounded. 4 men walked with her down the ridge, as the rest followed behind. Some out of curiosity, others out of duty, and many just to be seen. The man with the black cross watched her go. She didn't look back. The church hadn't changed. Same peeling white paint, same cracked bell tower. But this time it wasn't Sunday, and the people weren't here for prayer. The pews were packed. By dusk, men stood at the back with arms full. Women clutched their children's hands. The windows glowed orange from the setting sun, and the shadow of the cross fell long over the pulpit. She stood alone, facing them all. No defense, no advocate. Whitlow stepped up and spoke with the weight of a man convinced of his own righteousness. This woman, he declared, invited danger into Willow Creek. She challenged the laws that keep us safe. She placed her own will above the will of the Lord. A few murmured in agreement. She did not call for help when a man was bleeding. She did not come to the council. She made her own judgment, as if she were above the word. No one mentioned the pardon. No one spoke of the cross. And when Elder Dale suggested exile, no one objected. Whitlow smiled, victorious. Then it is decided. She would leave by morning, with nothing, not even the land her husband once tended. She stood still as the verdict fell over her like ash. Her breath did not catch. Her hands did not tremble. If they expected her to weep, she would not. Let them watch her break. They would wait a long time. Outside the church, the wind howled, and far off, beyond the try-line, a horse neighed once, then went silent. She walked out of the chapel alone, but someone was already waiting by the hitching post. A figure with a wide-brimmed hat standing in the last light of day. The church doors creaked shut behind her, but the murmurs inside still clung to her back like smoke. The final judgment had been passed. Exile by dawn, they called mercy. She called it what it was, abandonment dressed in Sunday clothes. She stepped into the cooling air. The sky had gone lavender, bleeding into indigo as the last traces of sunlight vanished beyond the hills. She saw them then, the crowd dispersing, in 2s and 3s, avoiding her gaze. The righteous always looked away when cruelty wore a collar, but one figure stood firm, the edge of the chapel steps, next to a saddled horse. The man with the black cross waited. He didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes were locked on hers, and for a long moment, neither of them breathed. She stepped closer. You shouldn't be here, she said softly. He tilted his head. You're not walking out of this place alone. She shook her head. They'll come after you. They already did, he said, and that was all. He reached for her hand, not forceful, not urgent, just an offering. She looked past him. Whitlow stood on the chapel porch now, his jaw clenched tight. Fitch beside him, fists at his sides. Behind them, the lanterns of the church cast flickering halos over the faces of men who didn't believe in miracles, only control. You'll burn for this, Whitlow called out. But the man didn't turn. He lifted her gently onto the saddle and swung up behind her in one fluid motion. The horse shifted beneath them, but the stranger's grip on the reins was steady. Then slowly, he turned the horse to face the crowd. He didn't speak. He didn't raise a weapon. He simply looked, first at the chapel, then at the faces gathered around it. He held their gaze like a mirror, showing them something they couldn't bear to see, and not one of them stepped forward. Not even Whitlow. Not even Fitch. The woman leaned back slightly, her shoulder against his chest. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt no weight on her lungs, no heaviness in her spine, only breath, only warmth. He clicked his tongue once and the horse began to move. They rode not in haste but in quiet, step by step through the center of town, past the general store, the blacksmith, the schoolhouse, all now dark and watching. No one dared stop them. Some turned their heads, a few bowed them, and one or two, the oldest, the tired, whispered blessings into the folds of their sleeve. She didn't cry, but something inside her broke free, like the first cracking of ice in a thawed river. They reached the ridge road, where the trees bowed low in the wind. She turned her head just slightly, and whispered, "Why did you come back?" He paused, "Because someone had to." They rode into the night like a story the town couldn't forget, and behind them, for the first time in years, Willow Creek stayed silent. The ride was long. Neither of them spoke. The hooves against dirt, the occasional cry of an owl, and the hush of wind through pine needles were the only sounds that dared fill the night. She leaned slightly against him, not out of fatigue but out of something quieter. By morning, they had crossed 2 ridge lines and followed the bend of a dry creek, until the world behind them faded into mist. Ahead lay a meadow surrounded by trees, broken only by the jagged frame of an old structure, a cabin half swallowed by vines and memory. He dismounted first, then helped her down. His hands were firm but gentle, as if he knew she wasn't used to being touched without